but see, that was his point. And that's what the point was. They were trying to solicit they were trying to solicit him being hostile in response to that act. And he knew it. He would have lost credibility, legitimacy, everything if he would have responded violently. And he had every right to, but he didn't. He understood that he was there for a bigger reason, bigger purpose. So, I was living in Blue Springs, Missouri in 1968. There were all kinds of race riots. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago turned into be one big riot. People were killed. Kent State University, ROTC issues up there where people were killed on campus at Kent State. I was 12 years old. I remember it very, very well. As many of you can remember what happened just a few short years when you were 12. And so you can remember things. And I remember very clearly 1968 and the race riots. It was a very ugly period in Kansas City, as it was in many of the cities across the nation. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And we had problems at the Democratic National Convention that summer. And there's all kinds of unrest and turmoil taking place. We appeared to learn something from that. We had almost a new awakening. We were right in the middle of the psychedelic decade of the 1960s. People were unhappy with the Vietnam War. There were people protesting against the Vietnam War, about our involvement in Vietnam. That brought the races together because both whites and blacks and other minorities were all concerned about Vietnam. And we had this thing called Woodstock, and you know, and everybody else became Jimi Hendrix fans and Janis Joplin fans, and on and on and on. And so we decided, wait a minute, we've got a lot in common here. We've got a lot of common interests. Art, science, politics, all those things. We didn't have that kind of unification before Vietnam and before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, did we? There was no mechanism there for us to come together for common concerns. You think I'm feeding you full of bad stuff here? You think it's, can you think of another reason maybe we started coming together after 1968 particularly? We had a long ways to go, didn't we? But that generation is now my age and older. In fact, that generation that I'm talking about is much older than I am, because I was still very much a young kid in 1968, 12 years old. I'm talking about the people who came together were in their 20s and in their 30s. And now those people are in their 60s and 70s now. And so things have changed. We can talk about this. Most of it can say that what Martin Luther King sought out to achieve, did he achieve most of the goals? I don't know that we can ever say that we've achieved all of the goals. But we're better, certainly, we can't say this, can we? From where he started? We can't, we might, it's a matter of perspective too. I mean, it's easy for me to stand up here and say, pick out one of these answers as being the best, but what do you have to say about it? And maybe what you have to say about it will prove my thesis earlier when I said that you're probably almost a non-racial generation compared to the generation before you. And because you're more non-racial than my generation was, then you probably would give a much different answer to these than maybe people in my generation did. But I don't think we could ever presume to say that the answer is they then, right?
No, it's not it.
So what happens in another, like, 50?
Even though we have an African American president.
because like, you know, my grandparents and not my mom, but my grandparents and their parents all seem so much more racial than like us. And then my kids are completely biased completely. And I think in another 50 years, you might be able to say that it's all gone. Because they die off.
Yeah.
I think that, like, as long as, like, people still have those ideas, they're going to give them to their children, they're going to give them to their children, it's just going to always carry down, so it'll always be there. I mean, how big a part it plays is different story, but, I mean, it'll always be there.
How many of you like ignorant people? I mean, just enjoy being around ignorant people? I mean, how many of you really just take pleasure in that? And how would you define who an ignorant person is? It doesn't mean they're stupid, does it?
I understand that there are other options. They choose to just stay on their opinions in the past.
But if a person's not stupid, but they're ignorant, why wouldn't you necessarily mind being around them?
Why would I mind it?
Yeah, why wouldn't you mind?
I don't enjoy hanging out with ignorance.
Pardon me?
I don't enjoy hanging out with ignorance. No. I like to try to, teach ignorant people, but if they're not going to learn, then they're not worth my time. Hang out with somebody else that's going to.
There are a lot of small little gas stations around southwest Missouri in these small towns, and that's usually where people go to congregate, and they gossip, and they talk about who's doing what to whom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they sit there in their jeans or whatever, and they talk. My community's no different. You go in there, and I don't dare say a word. Why?
Because it's just not worth it.
Well, because everybody in that room knows that I'm a college professor that teaches political science, and they're in there talking about this politician, that politician, this politician. And if I said anything, what would happen? No, it wouldn't start a war. They would all shut up. Wouldn't they? Because what they're talking from their paradigm, their take on the world. And it must be right because they talk about it over and over and over and over again every day, so it must be right. And they read the newspaper, and I love these people. And we could be talking about people in Mississippi, we could be talking about people in Massachusetts, it doesn't matter. I think you get my point. But they know what the world is, and they're not going to be told otherwise. And it could have to do with race, too. Not everybody goes to college. Not everybody joins the military. Not everybody moves away and comes back in with a different attitude. And so I'm not saying that these aren't good people, because they are. But like I said, we could be talking about any small community anywhere in the United States. So don't run home and tell your dad or whatever. That's not my point. Okay. You can kind of see the rest of this. I'm not going to make short shrift of it, but it is in your book, and we are kind of behind in trying to get into chapter 6. But what do you think if you were an Asian American and you grew up in the United States, and say you were a second or third generation American, and you were living in California in the 1930s, and life was just not great because Japanese Americans were discriminated against, Chinese Americans were discriminated against. And the book talks about how they were discriminated against in comparison to African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics, etc. But what would happen? What would you think? What must you think if all of a sudden, December 7th, 1941, something bad happens in Pearl Harbor and Japan bombs our Pacific Fleet? and all of a sudden someone shows up at your doorstep and incarcerates you and your entire family because of who you are, without regard to whether did you even commit an act, did you have knowledge about an act. It was just based on what you looked like. So let's go, and we're going to incarcerate you now. Your life literally falls apart. We're talking about in America. How would that make you feel?
Bad.
Did it need to be done? The rationale was that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is basically suspending habeas corpus, right? He was basically suspending your rights under the Bill of Rights. The due process provisions went totally out the window. The 14th Amendment was turned upon its head, equal rights. Patterning it after what Lincoln had done during the Civil War by suspending everybody's habeas corpus. Because he didn't know who the spies were. Because the northern people looked a lot like the southern people and vice versa, so how do we know who the bad guys were? So let's just arrest anybody that we think could have committed a crime without probable cause. Suspension of habeas corpus was really what was occurring in both instances, right? Can you imagine how you would feel today if just because of the way you looked, you would get arrested or detained? Are we talking about somebody that looks like a terrorist? Because that's the problem we're struggling with today, isn't it? Who is a terrorist? What does a terrorist look like? We're struggling with that, aren't we? No one wants to get on an airplane with the probability that they're going to be hijacked and they're going to crash into some building somewhere, like happened 10 years ago. So to prevent that, we're going to keep our eyes open for terrorists. The question is, what does a terrorist look like? Well, it must look like everybody. Because we have the TSA now, and we go through a very rigorous screening process to get on an airplane or get on an Amtrak and get on an Amtrak car. So are we moving back there again because of terrorist activity? Are we going to start losing our rights? Everybody losing their rights? Because after all, everybody looks like a terrorist because that's why we screen you. Is this making any sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
Is this why we have these kind of conversations? So maybe you'll pay attention to what's happening to you. You know, when I went to Washington, D.C. to a conference a year ago, I was so naive about traveling because I hadn't flown since 2007. And they've been ratcheting down the security requirements over the 10 years since 9/11. And by the time I flew out to LAX and Atascadero, California, twice, I think went out there in 2006 and then in 2007, I hadn't flown since, so by the time I went out there in November 2010, I hadn't flown for 4 or 5 years, 4 years, whatever it was, 3 years. I had no idea. And I hadn't paid attention. I never got on the internet to see what the restrictions were as far as shampoo, toothpaste, and you have to have something that's less than 2 ounces. So I go up to Kansas City, have dinner with my daughter in the plaza up there in Kansas City, and then I go on into the Kansas City International Airport, stay all night because I had a real early flight the next morning. Well, I realized that I still needed to go by Walgreens or someplace to pick up toiletries. So I go in there with the idea, I said, well, I'll go ahead, I'm not packed, I don't have a lot of stuff in my suitcase. I'll go ahead and get a bottle of shampoo so when I get home I can use it when I get home. I mean, why buy something this small? Because I don't travel that often. So I just buy a big container of Pantene and I'll have it when I get home. Same thing with toothpaste. You know, we always need to run to the store to get toothpaste like everybody else, so I just buy me a nice big tube of toothpaste and I'll have it when we get home. And I made several decisions like that. Well, I get to the airport, and boy, when they found out that I had those containers in there, they just started pitching them. You don't want these, do you, sir? No, I guess not. So all that money went down the tube. I was a suspect, I guess. But that was before the full body scan. Well, I hate to put anybody through that. How do you feel about the full body scan with regard to 14th Amendment? Reasonable right to privacy. That was the decision that was made under the 14th Amendment with regard to Roe v. Wade. A woman's reasonable right to privacy, to be able to make a decision whether she has an abortion or not. Well, what about your reasonable right to privacy when you go through an airport scanner? I mean, there's no privacy left. I mean, is there? I mean, when you're getting scanned, I mean, it's kind of, well, here I am. Are there any questions? I mean, that's kind of what it ends up, right? You always hear these stories about a TSA agent groping a young woman or a child or whatever. Some
Or
kid
making a,
it was in the news the other day where a young kid.
Age restriction now because of that? Like, nobody younger than 12 can be patted down or something?
So where do we draw the line is the question, and still feel like we have protection of the 14th Amendment, that we're not being lumped into this category, that we're all now terrorists. Is this a tough question?
yeah.
Very much.
Does it maybe get you a little bit interested in maybe being an advocate for one side of the argument or the other? Because some of you may be thinking that, and I'm not going to put you on the spot, some of you actually may be thinking that the government's not doing enough. Some of you might be thinking that the government's doing entirely too much.
It's just like when they evacuated the East Coast versus Katrina. I mean, if the government doesn't do enough, if something happens, the government didn't do enough. And then when they are trying to do as much as they
They're
can,
overreacting.
then we're saying
Yeah.
you're violating my
Yeah.
rights.
Well, a lot of people say, well, we overreacted. That was the
Right.
headline. They overreacted. Well, surely to goodness, if they didn't do anything, then things would have been, and it was bad enough. There was a lot of devastation
Yes,
out there.
there was.
There still is. But if they didn't do anything, then they would have gotten criticized. So it's kind of a no-win situation. We'll see on Monday. We'll get into chapter